Between 1967 and 1972, NASA launched some of the most ambitious missions in human history. 12 of them, back-to-back, strapped to the most powerful machine ever built. Some landed on the moon. Some almost didn't come back. One never launched at all. This is every Apollo mission, no filler, no fluff. Let's start with the rocket. The Saturn V, 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And that's what 5 Rocketdyne F1 engines produce at liftoff. For context, that's enough force to lift a fully loaded 747 about 800 times over, all concentrated into a single first stage. The Saturn V stood 363 feet tall, 33 feet wide, with a fin span of 63 feet. The vehicle that carried Apollo 11 weighed nearly 6.5 million pounds at ignition. Getting that off the ground wasn't engineering. It was controlled violence. The second stage added another million pounds of thrust from 5 J2 engines, pushing the spacecraft toward orbit after the first stage dropped away. Saturn V launched 12 times from Cape Canaveral between November 1967 and December 1972. Every crewed mission succeeded. Undefeated. Quick note, not every Apollo mission used a Saturn V. The earlier Earth orbit flights used the smaller Saturn 1B, but every mission headed for the moon rode this thing. It's the foundation everything else runs on. So what was the first crewed Apollo mission? Well, it was supposed to be routine. Apollo 1. January 27th, 1967 was not a launch day. That's the part most people get wrong. The rocket never moved. There was no countdown, no liftoff, no dramatic explosion in the sky. It was a routine pre-flight test at Launch Complex 34. The crew, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were sealed inside the capsule running through checklists. And then, at 6:31 p.m., a fire broke out. Here's what makes it horrifying. The spacecraft's voice and data transmissions cut out just 3 seconds after a structural rupture was recorded. 3 seconds. That's not a rescue window. That's barely a thought. Pad crews forced the hatches open roughly 5 minutes later, but the hatch design itself was part of the problem. It opened inward, against pressure, too slow by every measure that mattered. All 3 astronauts died inside the capsule. NASA grounded the entire program for 21 months. The Block 2 command module was completely redesigned. New hatch, new materials, new safety culture from the ground up. Every Apollo spacecraft that flew after this, every crew that made it home, exists in part because of what happened on a launch pad during a test that wasn't supposed to be dangerous. Apollo 1 didn't end the program. It's the reason the program survived long enough to succeed. Apollo 7. 20 months after the fire at Launch Complex 34, NASA sent 3 guys back to the exact same launch pad. Walter Schirra, Don Isley, and Walter Cunningham climbed into a redesigned Block 2 command and service module, strapped on top of a Saturn 1B, and launched on October 11, 1968. No moon, no lunar module. Just an Earth orbit mission to answer one question. Does the new spacecraft actually work? It did. Apollo 7 spent 10 days, 20 hours, 9 minutes, and 3 seconds in space, completing 163 orbits in a 123 by 153 nautical mile orbit. The crew ran rendezvous exercises with the Saturn 1B upper stage, tested every system they could get their hands on, and delivered the first live television broadcast from an American spacecraft. The show was called The Wally, Walt, and Don Show. Seriously, but here's the thing nobody talks about. All 3 astronauts had head colds for most of the mission. Stuffy noses in zero gravity are apparently miserable because mucus doesn't drain. The crew got cranky. They pushed back on mission control instructions. The tension got real enough that none of the 3 ever flew in space again. Still, Apollo 7 did exactly what it needed to do. It proved the machine worked. No drama, no headlines, just 11 days of unglamorous systems checkout that made everything after it possible. And what came after, it was not small. Apollo 8. 2 months after Apollo 7 proved the capsule worked, NASA made one of the boldest calls in the history of spaceflight. Skip the intermediate steps, skip the lunar module test. Just send 3 humans to the moon, not to land, just to orbit it. Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders climbed into a command module on top of a Saturn V, launched from Pad 39A on December 21st, 1968, and left Earth orbit entirely. That translunar injection burn was the point of no return. Once it fired, you're not in Earth orbit anymore. You're heading for the moon. And the only way home is another burn on the other side, the trans-Earth injection, which added 3,522 feet per second over 3 minutes and 23 seconds. Miss that burn, and you don't come home. They didn't miss it. Apollo 8 completed 10 lunar orbits over 6 days, covering 579,606.9 statute miles. The first humans to leave Earth's gravitational influence, orbit another world, and return. Fun fact, fact, William Anders is listed as lunar module pilot on the crew manifest despite the fact that Apollo 8 carried no lunar module. It was a crew role designation, not a hardware description. The man's official job title was to fly a spacecraft that wasn't there. On Christmas Eve, the crew read from the book of Genesis during a broadcast watched by the largest television audience in history at that point. And Anders took a photograph of Earth rising over the lunar horizon that became one of the most reproduced images ever made. The moon stopped being an abstraction. It was a place you could go. And now, someone had to actually land on it. But first, they needed to test the machine that would get them down there. Apollo 9. While Apollo 8 was busy making history by flying to the moon, Apollo 9 stayed home. And honestly, its job was harder. Apollo 9 launched from Kennedy Space Center's Pad 39A on Saturn V, number 504. At ignition, the vehicle weighed about 6.5 million pounds, and the first stage peaked at roughly 9.2 million pounds of thrust. 10 minutes and 59 seconds later, the crew was in Earth orbit. But getting to orbit wasn't the point. The point was the lunar module. See, NASA had this two-spacecraft system designed for the moon landing. The command module stays in orbit, the lunar module drops down to the surface, then flies back up and docks with the command module again. Elegant on paper, never been tested with humans inside. That's called a problem. So Apollo 9 ran the full dress rehearsal. Over 10 days in Earth orbit, the crew docked the lunar module to the command service module, undocked it, flew the lunar module independently, then had to find the command module again and redock. First time that had ever been attempted with a crewed lunar module. Two separate spacecraft operating independently in orbit, rejoining on a tight timeline with human lives depending on the math being right. They did it in Earth orbit on purpose. If something went catastrophically wrong, rescue was at least theoretically possible. Around the moon, not so much. Nobody talks about Apollo 9. There's no iconic photo, no dramatic near-death moment, but without it, Apollo 11 doesn't happen. It quietly solved the hardest logistical puzzle of the entire program, proving two spacecraft could dance together in the void and not kill anyone. So now NASA had a working command module, a working lunar module, and proof they could operate together. Time to put it all together in one final test run. Apollo 10, May 18, 1969. NASA launched everything, the full Saturn V, a command service module called Charlie Brown, a lunar module called Snoopy. 3 astronauts, Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan. They flew to the moon, entered lunar orbit, and Stafford and Cernan climbed into Snoopy, undocked, and descended to within roughly 50,000 feet of the lunar surface, close enough to scout the landing site, close enough to see boulders, close enough to practically smell the regolith, and then they came home, without landing. This was the dress rehearsal. Every single maneuver Apollo 11 would need performed for real in the actual lunar environment, just without the final act. Translunar injection pushed them from 25,593 feet per second to 36,651 feet per second. They completed 31 lunar orbits over 8 days, 23 minutes, and 23 seconds, covering about 829,000 miles a round trip. But here's the best part. NASA deliberately underfueled the lunar module. Snoopy did not carry enough propellant to reach the surface and launch back up. The crew physically could not have landed even if they'd wanted to. NASA looked at 3 test pilots orbiting the moon 50,000 feet above the biggest achievement in human history and said, yeah, we don't trust you not to try it. Honestly, fair. Splashdown was May 26th, recovered by USS Princeton. 8 weeks later, Apollo 11 launched. And everything it did, it could do because Apollo 10 did it first. So what happened when they finally went for the landing? Apollo 11. July 16, 1969. Saturn V. AS-506 lifted off from Kennedy Space Center carrying Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. The mission objective was almost comically simple on paper. Land on the moon, come back alive. 8 years of engineering, 3 dead astronauts, and roughly 400,000 workers had led to this. The vehicle entered an Earth parking orbit of about 100 by 99 miles, and then translunar injection committed the crew to the moon. No turning back, Armstrong and Aldrin descended in the lunar module. Collins stayed in lunar orbit aboard the command module, alone. Every time he passed behind the moon, he lost all radio contact with Earth and with his crewmates. No signal, no voice, nothing. Just one human being and the silence of deep space. Arguably the loneliest job anyone has ever had. Armstrong and Aldrin landed. They walked on the moon. They came back. Now, briefly, because someone in the comments will bring it up, the moon landing hoax theory. The Soviets tracked the mission independently. They had every reason to call it fake and didn't because they they couldn't because it wasn't. There are 382 kilograms of lunar samples distributed to scientists across the world. The telemetry records exist, the paper trail's exhaustive. Moving on. Splashdown was July 24th, 1969. 8 days, 3 hours, 18 minutes. The thing humans had been trying to do since Kennedy's speech in 1961 was done, but landing once doesn't prove you can do it again. So NASA went back. Apollo 12, November 14th, 1969. Apollo 12 launches from Pad 39A into a sky that absolutely nobody should have been launching into. Thick clouds, rain, the kind of weather where you cancel a picnic, let alone a moon mission. 36 seconds after liftoff, lightning strikes the vehicle. The entire instrument panel lights up like a Christmas tree. 16 seconds later, lightning strikes it again, and the Saturn V just keeps going. Flight controllers on the ground scrambled to diagnose the electrical chaos in real time, resetting systems while the rocket was still climbing. The crew, Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Richard Gordon, rode a spacecraft that had just absorbed 2 direct lightning bolts in under a minute and didn't flinch. This wasn't a planned stress test. This was what mission-critical hardware reliability actually looks like when the universe decides to test it for you. But here's the part that doesn't get enough credit. After parking in orbit at about 115 by 118 miles, Apollo 12 flew to the moon and landed on November 19th in the Ocean of Storms. Not just anywhere in the Ocean of Storms. They landed within walking distance of Surveyor 3, an uncrewed probe that had been sitting on the lunar surface since 1967. They hit a target the size of a parking lot from 250,000 miles away. Apollo 11 proved we could get to the moon. Apollo 12 proved that we could pick a specific address on the moon and park in the driveway. 10 days, 4 hours, 36 minutes, and 25 seconds of total mission time, splashing down about 3 miles from the USS Hornet. So what happens when the next mission doesn't go according to plan at all? Apollo 13, April 11th, 1970. Saturn V AS-508. Crew, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, Fred Hayes. Destination, the moon. They didn't get there. Somewhere on the way out, an oxygen tank in the service module failed. And here's the thing. The exact timing of when it happened is genuinely disputed in the historical record. One source puts it at about 30 hours, 40 minutes into the mission. NASA's own mission report references loss of cryogenic oxygen at approximately 56 hours. Both numbers exist in the documentation. Neither has been cleanly reconciled, so we're not going to pretend one is right. What we do know is that the command module lost power, lost oxygen, and became uninhabitable. So the crew did the only thing they could. They moved into the lunar module, a spacecraft designed to keep 2 people alive on the moon's surface for about 2 days. Now it had to keep 3 people alive for the entire trip home. It was never built for this. It didn't have the power margins, the consumables, or the carbon dioxide scrubbing capacity for 3 crew members over multiple days, but it was the only pressurized volume with a working engine and functioning life support, so that's what they used. The LM's descent propulsion system, the engine meant to land on the moon, fired mid-course corrections to adjust the return trajectory. One burn came at 105 hours, 18 minutes, 28 seconds into the mission. The lunar module kept 3 people breathing in a role nobody at Grumman ever designed it for. Splashdown, 142 hours, 54 minutes, 41 seconds, coordinates 21 degrees, 38 minutes, 24 seconds south, 165 degrees, 21 minutes, 42 seconds west. Crew recovered within 45 minutes. Apollo 13 never landed on the moon. It's remembered anyway, not because something went wrong, but because of what the hardware and the people inside it managed to do with a broken spacecraft in the dark. So NASA had a choice: stop or keep going. Apollo 14. Remember Apollo 13? The mission that nearly killed 3 astronauts and never reached the moon. Apollo 14 was the do-over. Same target, same geology, same unfinished business. Framaro was waiting, and this time, someone was actually going to walk on it. The crew was Alan Shepard, Edgar Mitchell, and Stuart Roosa. And Shepard is a wild card here. This guy was the first American in space back in 1961, a full decade earlier during the Mercury program. Now he's 47 years old, strapping into a lunar module, about to become the oldest person to walk on the moon. That's not a career arc, that's a character arc. They launched January 31st, 1971 from Pad 39A and landed on the moon on February 5th at the Fra Mauro Highlands. 2 EVAs followed. The first lasted 4 hours, 48 minutes, the second 4 hours, 35 minutes, nearly 9.5 hours of surface work. They collected the geological samples Apollo 13 never got to touch. And then Shepard did something beautifully stupid. He smuggled a golf club head onto the moon, attached it to a sample tool handle, dropped 2 golf balls onto the lunar surface, and swung on the moon in a pressurized suit. One of the most absurd and genuinely human moments in the entire space program. Splashdown was February 9th. Mission accomplished. Framaro sampled. Apollo 13's unfinished chapter closed. Apollo 14 doesn't get the glory of 11 or the drama of 13, but it quietly did what needed doing. It proved the program wasn't broken, finished the science a crippled spacecraft had to abandon, and reminded everyone that Apollo was still very much in business. Now it was time to go bigger. Apollo 15. On July 26, 1971, Apollo 15 launched from Kennedy Space Center, and the program changed. Crew was David Scott, Alfred Worden, and James Irwin. But the real story isn't the crew, it's the category. Apollo 15 was the first J mission. That's NASA's designation for a new class of Apollo flight, one built around science instead of spectacle. Upgraded hardware, extended surface capability, expanded experiment packages. Everything before Apollo 15, every mission we've talked about, was essentially a proof of concept. Can we get there? Can we land? Can we walk around and come back alive? Apollo 15 said, okay, we proved all that. Now what can we actually do up there? And the answer started with a car. Apollo 15 carried the first lunar roving vehicle, an electric buggy that let astronauts drive across the lunar surface instead of walking it. And this matters more than it sounds. Without the rover, you're limited to wherever your legs and your oxygen supply can take you. With it, you can cover real ground. You can do real geological field work. You can actually explore. The crew performed 3 EVAs totaling roughly 18 hours and 37 minutes on the surface, a program record. They spent about 90 hours in lunar orbit conducting scientific observations. Total mission duration, approximately 295 hours, the longest Apollo mission to that point. This is the inflection point. Before Apollo 15, the program was about proving humans could reach the moon. Apollo 15 was the beginning of proving why they should. It stopped being a visit and started being an expedition. And the standard it set, Apollo 17 would push it even further. Apollo 17. December 7th, 1972, 12:33 in the morning, Apollo 17 lit up the Florida night from Launch Complex 39, riding Saturn V, AS-512, into the sky. It was the only night launch in the entire Apollo program, and by every account, it turned darkness into daylight for miles. Crew: Gene Cernan commanding, Ron Evans in the command module, and Harrison Schmitt in the lunar module. Schmitt was a professional geologist, not a test pilot, not a military aviator, a guy who'd spent his career reading rocks. Every other person who had walked on the moon came from the cockpit. For the final mission, NASA finally sent someone trained to read the ground beneath his boots. They landed at Taurus Littrow, and then they stayed. 75 hours on the surface, 3 EVAs totaling 40.5 man-hours, the most of any Apollo mission. The rover covered roughly 27.9 kilometers. They collected 110.4 kilograms of lunar samples, 243 pounds, the largest single mission haul in the program. On the way home, Ron Evans performed a spacewalk lasting 1 hour and 6 minutes to retrieve film canisters from the outside of the spacecraft. Just casually floating in deep space, grabbing film splashdown came on December 19th, 1972, after approximately 12 days and 7 hours. Before climbing the ladder for the last time, Gene Cernan said, "We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind." Nobody has been back. Apollo 17 closed the program at its absolute scientific peak. The most surface time, the most samples, the first geologist on another world, the final footsteps. The Saturn V flew 12 times and never lost a crew. The program launched in tragedy, adapted under pressure, landed 6 times on the moon, and walked away having done exactly what it set out to do. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.